What's up, guys? Shawnthebro here, and today we're going to be going over making all of our movement better in general. So we're going to be fixing our character movement, our character collisions with the hurtbox and capsule collider. We're going to make jumps become static jumps. So essentially, they will work based off of if you are jumping back, for example, you have a set distance that you will jump back, and same with forward, and same with up and down, really. We're also going to make our own jump system, period, so we have more control over it. And we're going to make sure our pushing is also updated, because our pushing was actually a bit incorrect last time. So the logic behind it was good. However, because of some of the physics that we had, our pushing would be a little bit inconsistent, where we always want it to be consistent. You can see that is the case now. And we can still do things like throws and everything with our new setup. So this is really part one of, however many, part one of at least two, but of making our movement and our mechanics smoother. And again, as we get into this combat logic, I keep finding things that I want to prepare beforehand, because I don't want to come up with hacks or things on the spot to try and fix issues that really are with underlying systems. That's why we fixed our block last episode, and that's why we're going to be fixing up a lot of our movement now. So to start things off, let's go into the code in our fighter template character. And this is episode, we are far along at this point, 88, I believe this one is. So if you want to catch up to the series, I'll leave the link to the iCard right here. This is the fighting game playlist, has all the episodes up to this date, so you can get caught up to everything we've done in the series. Otherwise, I'll leave this episode right here, which has to do with some of our movement in the past that we've done, specifically the input stack icons and the jumping and different things like that. Could be useful for today if you see anything on here that you want to check out and learn more about, but I'll be covering it in a lot of depth, so I don't believe you'll need to watch prior episodes to enhance if you already have this movement down. Alright, so let's start with our jump system. We want to update our jump system a bit, because we want our jumps to be static in this case. I call them static, but really what I mean is we want our jumps to be consistent. If we're jumping to the left, jumping to the right, or jumping backward or forward, for me, in my opinion, it should always be the same distance. You can change your jump distances based on character or something like that, but every time you're doing something such as a backward jump with a character, it should be consistent. We don't want it to work off momentum like it currently does. If you do want that, then great. You don't have to change anything with your jumping system. But if you do want the consistent jumps, like I do, then that's what we're going to be covering right now. So we're going to cover a few things in this episode, as I said. So just be ready to check out some of the changes that we've made. Let's start with our variables for the jump system. So there's really two things that we need to determine how our jump is going to react. And then we also are going to make our own jump system with jump count, so that we can jump multiple times if we wanted to for a character. Some characters can do that, and I'm just trying to open up that possibility. The default jumping system has this functionality, but since we're kind of making our own system now, we can just simply add it in ourselves. So I made 4 variables for jumping. I've made jump height and jump distance. And it should be pretty self-explanatory, but jump height is the actual height off the ground that the character will go from the jump. The jump distance is, of course, the actual horizontal distance that the character will go from the jump. Then I also have a jump count and a max jump count. So these are, the jump count is how many times you've currently jumped before you have touched the ground. And the max jump count is how many times the character can jump before they have to touch the ground, before they can no longer jump. Now, in almost all cases, this will probably only be 1, but there are some cases where characters can double jump or even fly in fighting games. And so I wanted to keep this a little bit open. Most importantly, we don't want them to jump infinitely, so we do need to put some sort of counter on it and some sort of maximum value. Alright, now those are all the variables we need for jumping. So once you've made them, you can go into your fighter template character.cpp, and you can set all your jump variables. I set jump height to 1000, jump distance to 400, max jump count to 1, and jump count to 0. All right, let's also go over two functions that we may use today. I say may because it does depend on which method you want to use, and we'll get into this in a second. But this is specifically referring to some of our stuff with collision. So one of the changes we're going to be making in today's episode, on top of all the other changes, this one is going to be changing our collision to work off of our hurtbox. Now this is super important because fighting games do this. Yes, we have a capsule collider that controls our character in a lot of ways. However, we need our hurt boxes to be our true indicators. I was playing fighting games with frame data enabled and hurt boxes being visible, and I noticed that, there's nothing really using the capsule collider. Even if the characters in the game have the capsule collider, that's not what's determining collision. The hurt boxes determine the collision. And so what we need to do is transfer our system to not work off of if the players are colliding with their capsule collider, but rather if they're colliding with their hurt boxes. So because of this, I'm going to add some functions in here that are going to kind of swap this from the capsule collider to these hurt boxes we made. And I'm also going to enable the ability, I'm going to give the ability to enable or disable collision with player to player on the hurt boxes. This is going to be important later. Specifically next episode. However, it should start to make sense why it could be useful in this episode. So what I've done is I've made a blueprint implementable event called ignore player to player collision. And I'm being very specific here because I'm saying ignore collision between players. We don't want to ignore collision with everything, otherwise we'd fall through the floor or be able to go through the map boundaries, things like that. But we do want to be able to, in some cases, ignore collision with another player. And so this is going to be useful a lot more down the line, but it is going to be useful today as well. So go ahead and set up a blueprint implementable event that looks like this. And then we also want another function. I'm going to make one called custom launch character. And really what I'm going to do is just have the regular launch character parameters. Launch velocity should override XY, should override Z. And then I'm adding another Boolean in here. Should ignore character collision, which is essentially referring to this function call and the Boolean inside of it. And I'm going to set that to false in the function. If you've never seen this before, this is called a default parameter, an optional parameter, different things like this. It has different names, but really what this means is that we're setting this value to automatically be false. So this will always be false unless we tell it that it should be true. Unless we manually put in true when we call this function, it will default to false. So since the majority of the time we're not going to want to ignore player-to-player collision, I made this false. However, there are a few cases where we would want that to be true, so we can override it. With that long explanation out of the way, and once you've made these functions, let's get back into the jump. Okay, so for the jump, you can see that I do the normal checks that I always do. If the player can move, if they're not crouching, if they're not in a combo state. And I've added this new one. If jump count is less than max jump count. Assuming that the number of jumps the player or the character has currently performed is less than the maximum amount they can perform, we can allow them to jump. In this case, I call ignore player to player collision. Now, what I'm doing here is I'm going to disable the collision between the players so that when you're jumping, you never get caught up by the other player's hurt box. This is not the standard way to cover this issue and to fix this problem. The standard way to fix issues with jumping, you'll notice when you jump in a fighting game, you'll pretty much never actually collide with the enemy if they're standing on the ground. You're always going to jump over them. This actually works by shrinking the jumping character's hurt box. And same with when you launch an enemy, it actually shrinks their hurt box as well. So you can jump into them in the air, and it will still actually slow you or stop you, and you can't go through them. By ignoring collision entirely here, we will be able to go through them. That's probably not what we want. So we are going to be able to shrink and modify our hurt boxes and spawn new hurt boxes on our characters in the next episode of this Smooth Movement, Smooth Collision mini-series. However, the reason I am bringing this up right now is because there are people who want to use the complex hurt boxes. Because of that, you may need to ignore collision entirely for your capsule collider or for your main hurtbox to get this system to work. So you can feel free to leave this in for now, and in the next episode we will refine it to where we can just shrink the hurtboxes as opposed to ignore them entirely. Or if you really want, or you like the effect, then you can completely ignore entirely while jumping, and that can be part of your game. Alright, now the rest of the logic is pretty much the standard, except we've done something to change the launch character in here. So let's go over this. Before, what we were doing is we weren't launching our character on jump at all. We were adding an input icon to screen, and we were calling a character jump, and then determining which direction we wanted to go, all that stuff. Depending on if we're moving left, moving right. This time, what I've done is I've commented out this function call, a character : jump, because this jump will use physics and momentum that your character has to determine how the jump should be. What we want is a static jump, so I'm using launch character with our parameters that we made: jump distance, jump height, or if it's a standard vertical jump, just jump height. These are actually important, these overrides, because they come into play for our static jumps. So, if we're moving left in any case, we know that we are moving left regardless of what direction we're facing, which means our jump should always be the same distance. Whether it's forward or backward does not matter here. We just want to have, this is our moving left jump. So if you want to separate your forward jump and your backward jump distances, you will need to check if the character is facing right when performing this. However, I don't care. I have the same distance for both. I just want to make sure that we are jumping the right direction with our variables. So if we're moving left, whether it's forward or backward for our character, I'm using negative jump distance with our jump height. I'm calling custom launch character, not just launch character, and to call this, you'll need to, of course, make the definition. So we can go to the custom launch character definition, and we can fill this out now. So this is what it looks like for me. You'll notice launch character gets called at the bottom. Look at the launch character parameters. It has an F vector launch velocity, Boolean XY override, Boolean Z override. And I passed in all those with that additional Boolean. Alright, the logic inside is very, very simple. I checked the last Boolean, which remember, defaults to false. So unless we actually manually put in true, this will always be false. Should ignore character collision. If it's true though, we do want to call the ignore player-to-player collision. So we're calling ignore player-to-player collision and setting it to true here, which means we don't need to do it in the jump function. We can do it right in this custom launch character function. And then we just call launch character. Pretty simple stuff. Launch character is a default function that's in the a character class for Unreal, and then we're passing it the data that we gave it in the jump function, or anytime we call launch character, really. So you can see I've passed in true to override the X, Y, and the Z, which means when we do this jump, all three axes, the X-axis, Y-axis, and Z-axis will be overwritten to use this launch character, regardless of their previous momentum, speed, anything like that. And then true to ignore the player-to-player collision during this jump. Okay? And then if we're moving right, it's the same deal, except not negative. So jump distance, jump height, and then true, true, true. If it's a static jump, meaning I'm just stationary and I jump completely vertically, then we are going to say false. We don't need to override X or Y because we're not moving either of those directions. Although you could and just set it to be 0, as I've done here. And you'll make sure that you don't accidentally move and, a little bit left or a little bit right when you're jumping vertically. The Z-axis does need to be overwritten so that we can jump straight up. And true to ignore collision while jumping. I then increase the jump count. We've already used the jump, so we want to increase it. If we only have one, then that's the only jump we can perform. The character state still gets set to jumping afterward. And if we're in the knockdown state and we go to press the jump key, then we do start going into the recovery state. Okay. Now, in landed, we already had this logic commented out because I didn't really want to use the a character landed logic. Well, now we had some logic in here in the past to basically check if we were jumping and then make sure that we're not hitting an actor when we're landing. And this stuff's fine. We'll leave it for now. We'll need to adjust it more in the next episode when we adjust the hurt boxes, because this will actually cause some issues when the hurt box size changes. And we don't want to do that. So because of that, there's really no reason to mess with this now because it'll need to be modified next episode anyway. So leave everything you have inlanded, but toward the bottom, I've done 2 additional things. It's not in any of the if statements. This is just anytime we land. We reset the jump count, reset it back to 0. The character should now be able to jump again. If we want to be really specific, we can make sure that we are landing on the ground before we reset the jump count. However, we're taking out the ability to be able to land on the character's head or on the character at all with our hurt box changes that we're making now. So really the only thing you should be able to land on is the ground. If I find that we need special cases, then we can adjust it. Okay, and then I set ignore player-to-player collisions to false, which means we no longer want to ignore these collisions, which means we will collide with the player again. When the collisions are no longer being ignored, it will forcefully push the characters away from each other so that they are not in contact with each other anymore, which is what we want. However, we are probably going to want to do it more manually as opposed to automatically, because if we do it automatically, it will snap out. So say you jump onto another player and collision is ignored. They will snap away from each other. Whereas we probably want them to push out of each other. That way it looks more natural. However, for now it works. All right, and that is our jumping logic. Now, one thing we want to do to wrap up this part of this episode is the custom launch character stuff. So in our code, if you press Control and F at the same time on your keyboard, you can bring up the find. We're going to find where we've typed launch character anywhere in the past. You're going to hit the little arrow to bring up the replace button, and then we're going to type in the launch character again, but we're going to add custom in the front. So custom launch character. We're going to replace all instances of launch character with custom launch character. We're going to click both of these boxes, which means it's going to match the whole word and match the case. And then we're going to click this button to replace all. Right? Now, that's going to change all the ones in your code from launch character to custom launch character. Because we set this to be an optional variable, you don't need to fill this in. If you don't fill it in, it just takes in this value as false. So let's go to one of the places that we call launch character. So let's say, let's move right. Let's say perform pushback. See, we're calling launch character here, and we only have 2 booleans put in. We could put in the 3rd boolean for if it should ignore collision, but we don't want it to ignore collision when we're taking damage. So we don't put in the parameter. We can change our function to that, and you don't have to update any of your functions. So now everything should say custom launch character as opposed to launch character, but you don't have to change anything. So no big deal there. One minor thing, because I did replace all, the one in custom launch character will also say custom launch character. Make sure the only version of regular launch character that you see in your project is the one inside the custom launch character function. All right. Now, those were some pretty big changes. So we'll test them out and play around with it before we get into some more stuff. However, one thing we should do is we should make sure that we have our variables ready for the next update, because it's going to be pretty much strictly in Blueprint. We're just going to make the variable in code. So if we go to our variables and our character yet again, and scroll down, we had something called simple hurtbox or main hurtbox, whatever. I said it could be called a few different things, and it was a T array of hitbox actors. Well, I decided that we never use the hurtbox actor as being a hurtbox actor, really. I mean, all we've really done with it is attach it to our character and then we check if there's collision. It does not need to be a hurtbox actor in any way. In fact, we can determine if it's a hurtbox based on different things about it, like who its owner is, what it's attached to, and it doesn't have to be a hurtbox type. So, to make things more simple, we can actually attach just the static mesh component on the character. We'll be able to see it all the time. So we'll be able to see it in the viewport of the character without playing the game. So we can modify its size and different things like that. And we will also be able to see it when we set it to be visible or invisible, just like we could in the past. So really, we lose nothing by changing this. So what I've done is the same way I've done a complex hurtbox array, which don't worry if you haven't watched this. It's not necessary if you're not using complex hurtboxes, which is just an optional video that I added for the sake of it. The rest of this tutorial series going forward is going to be use what I call simple hurtboxes, which is just basic shapes like cubes, squares, rectangles, all these different things. So I've still called it simple hurtbox array, but I've changed it from hitbox actor to use static mesh component. Once you make this change, you will have a few errors in the blueprint, which we'll fix up, but I think you'll find it much, much nicer to use this system because we'll be able to modify our collision with the component and have complete freedom over our hurtbox being the one to push characters as opposed to our capsule collider, which is our end goal here. Okay, so save and build all this when you're ready. Okay, and then you can launch the game. Once this loads, let's go over and take a look at all of the stuff we did for our jumping logic. Let's make sure everything looks how it should before we proceed into some more of the fixes and adjustments. We definitely have to be able to do that. Alright, and once you notice you can jump, then try it at different speeds. So just tap your buttons together. Okay, so this is just vertical. This is a forward jump. You can see I get some pretty good distance off it. Backward jump. Now let me walk full speed and jump. You can see I get the same distance that I did when I just tapped it. That's good. That means our jumps are working and consistent. That is something we want in this series, and it makes our gameplay feel a lot better. Works for both player 1 and 2. Also make sure your max jump count is working. So you can hear me slamming these buttons. I can't jump more than one time. Okay, I can only jump once I land again. Okay, good. Now we know our jump system is working. Now, some things with the collision are still going to be weird. And because you changed that one variable, if you were actually using the simple hurtbox array, you won't be able to do this without fixing a few things. So let's go in and fix up any issues that could arise from changing that one variable. We're going to need to go to two places, the hitbox actor BP and the base character BP. So in base character BP, in the begin play, we were spawning hurtboxes after the characters were created, which makes sense. Before, we had all this stuff in here. Look at this. We had all this stuff we were adding to the simple hurtbox array, attaching it, setting the visibility. A little crazy, right? Now look how much smaller it is. This stuff is only because we have two hurtbox systems in the game. For you, you only need one. This is only for the tutorial series, so you'll either only have this function call or now this. Again, I'm going to use the simple hurtbox array going forward, so there's no reason to copy this other stuff if you don't plan on having specialized hitboxes, just to show you guys for those that did not watch so that this doesn't get confusing. I don't want to confuse anyone. On the mutant BP and on each specific character, I now have this new hurtbox, and I'll get to that in a second. However, we also have all these hurtboxes. This is what I'm calling complex hurtboxes. Okay, so if I make this one invisible. These are hurtboxes that are attached to different points of the character, and they better represent where the character is and where they can be hurt. However, most games do not use this level of hurtboxes. They just use simple squares or rectangles to represent the boundaries. Okay, because this was a requested episode, I happily did it, and I happily implemented the logic that is required. However, we actually are lacking on our simple hurtboxes So it's time for us to fix those up and make them work right, since that's what we're going to be using going forward. Okay. So this is what it looks like, but don't worry, we're going to cover adding this. Don't worry about it now. I just want to show you the difference. So let's go back to where we were. So all you need to do in spawn hurtboxes now, remember, this is all the logic we had before. Old simple hurtbox collision spawning. All you need to do now is take your simple hurtbox array. Okay, you can delete this. I left it in just to show you, not to confuse you. You can delete everything here if you want. We're no longer going to be spawning the hurtbox actor, BP, and attaching it. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to add a component to our base character BP. Specifically, click on your mesh so that it becomes a child of this. Make it a static mesh. Okay, this will become a static mesh component. And then when you create it, everything here will be empty. I renamed mine, right-click rename, and called it main hurtbox. I am calling it main because when I was playing fighting games, I realized that one hurtbox, your main hurtbox is what I call it, is the one that actually resizes and determines kind of, oh, this is what my hurtbox should look like in this attack or in this state. And we have other hurtboxes that spawn on certain attacks or cover things like our legs, since they could be separate from our chest hurtbox, different things like that. So I'm calling this one main hurtbox. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it hurtbox 1 if you want. We're going to have more. But this is the first one, and that's what we're starting with today. So add this, call it whatever you want. I did not add anything here. You definitely could. But because our hurtboxes could be in different positions, different sizes, I'm going to add them on the specific characters. So base character BP, I've added the static mesh component. Because the mutant BP and all my other children are children of base character BP, then they are going to automatically inherit this main hurtbox. And you can see that it says inherited. So here is where I've selected my hurtbox. I put a cube as the mesh and my hurtbox material as the material. All right. I haven't changed anything else manually for this character other than the size. Feel free to change its location, size, and rotation to fit your character. Again, we will have multiple of these in the future, but for now this is a good start just to have one. All right. Now, in the base character BP, because again we want these changes to work for all characters, I did a few things. So first of all, with the main hurtbox selected in the details, you can click on class defaults to open this up. I've put the collision enabled to world dynamic. It doesn't really matter what type you put in here. I just put this to a type that I knew I wasn't using for. I wasn't setting it to pawn because pawn is used for a few other things, and I didn't want to make that confusing. So when you come in here, it'll probably be overlap all or block all. I can't remember what the default is. But I set it to be custom, changed the object type to world dynamic, and left everything on block all. Okay. That's going to become more important later because we are going to work with collision channels, a little bit more carefully for some of the things that we have to do with different collisions, such as ignoring hurtbox to hurtbox collision. After that, you don't have to change anything else. You can see that nothing except things with the yellow arrow are things that I've changed. So I haven't changed anything else, and you don't need to. You just need this static mesh here so that on the character BP itself, you can actually have this mesh and change things if you have to. Now, since you changed that, and assuming that you got rid of the broken logic because of the old symbol hurtbox array and all that stuff that was here, you can get rid of this stuff if you'd like. All right? So you can just flat out delete that. Now, the other thing with this is that I had a main hurtbox reference. And you can use this main hurtbox reference if you want. But we're going to be changing this up a little bit to use that simple hurtboxes array. So it's up to you if you want to change it now or not. But if you right-click on main hurtbox reference, find references, and find the two values, where we actually use it in the base character BP, feel free to switch it out for the simple hurtbox array 0. Nothing wrong with doing that. And again, we can do it right now if we want. So the way this would look, these are our initial things to change it for when we crouch and such. What we can do is grab our simple hurtbox array. We can get a copy. And change set world scale 3D from set actor scale 3D. Split the struct pin. And then set all the values. 1.0, 1.0, 1.0. Put this here. Move this to where that would be. And then you see here that we also need to connect this to add actor local offset. What I'm going to do is delete this for now. And delete the hurtbox offset for now as well. You can find the references and see that it's only also altered in the hurtbox offset in the modify hurtbox function. Well, we don't really care about this right now. We're going to be changing this in a new method now and changing special hurtboxes in special conditions. So what we can actually do is in modify hurtboxes, we can get rid of this there, the offset. It could be useful, so I'm not going to get rid of this function or anything like that, but I'm going to get rid of that node. And I'm going to make this look a little bit nicer. But we're going to do the same change that we did here. So we are going to get the simple hurtbox array. We're actually going to pass in the specific hurtbox that we want in the future. We can get a copy. And we can set world scale 3D. Split it. And then pass these in. Set this back to 1. We're going to change it based off the specific hurtbox that we need to modify. So things are changing around here a little bit. So I've done this just to get rid of the errors. Okay. So you can see this is what reset and modify hurtbox look like now. I can also get rid of hurtbox offset and main hurtbox reference. Compile, save, try and run, and everything builds fine. All right, so now we cleaned up some of that gross stuff. And what we need to do is add our main hurtbox component, not our main hurtbox reference. You saw I just got rid of the variable. This static mesh component needs to be added to our simple hurtbox array. So all you have to do is type in simple hurtbox array, drag off of it, and type add. And then you need to pass in a static mesh component, which, funnily enough, we have one called main hurtbox. All right. So this is all you need to do to spawn it now and keep track of what hurtbox our character has. Now, we don't need to spawn hurtboxes anymore, but there's a big change that we're making here that's super important. So at the end of begin play, this will happen for both player 1 and player 2 if we're on keyboard mode, or of course both players if they're using independent controllers. We need to stop the capsule component from being the thing that drives our collision. We now want to use our hurtbox. Okay? So instead of using our hurtbox actor just in our base character BP, we just want to use this main hurtbox now. But this collision in the past, you see it has the default collision of pawn. And these are the default stats. I have not changed them. But we want to edit this stuff now. We want to make sure that the collision response to channel is overlap. This is super important. You can't just change the collision in here. If you change the collision in here, everything that's a child of this component, which is pretty much everything that can be a child in your character, will take that as a starting point. So for example, if I set the collision presets to have no collision on this capsule component, yes, that would ignore collision on the capsule component. Everything under it would also ignore collision. What we can do instead is set the collision response to a specific channel, and you could do that in here if you're familiar with it. Really what we're doing is we're just forcing the capsule component, okay, capsule component, set collision, collision response to channel. This one right here. We're grabbing the channel upon, and we're setting it to be overlap as opposed to ignore. You probably could do ignore as well, but overlap I like because it does still generate the events, which could be useful in the future, even if we're not using collision on the actual capsule collider anymore. Could be good to know certain distances, what characters are, and things like if they've landed on you or if they're on the ground. So I like overlap more than I like ignore. But regardless, so just for that channel, we want to overlap. And this means that the capsule colliders will no longer collide with each other, and thus they will ignore each other, and your characters will be able to walk through each other. Very, very useful stuff. Okay. Now, this means that our hurtbox component here is going to be what's blocking everything. Because the mesh itself should be set to character mesh, which it is, which doesn't always block everything. For example, it completely ignores pawn. So your meshes should not block each other. If they do, you can change the collision presets on the mesh. But now, our main hurtbox should be what's handling the collision. Now, there's one other thing we need to do before this will be working properly. So in our hitbox actor BP, you may have to change around some of your logic for your hurtboxes on your character yet again, because we've now changed it to this array. But don't worry, we will be keeping it as this array now. It won't be changing in the future. So in check collision, I'll show you everything that I have. However, really what it is this is more complex than it needs to be because of, again, the complex hurtboxes. So you can ignore the top branch here. However, if you do have the complex hurtboxes in your tutorial series, you can use it as a great reference point. In fact, I duplicated the function and made one called check simple collision. It's the same thing as check complex collision, except we use a different array. Okay? You see that? It's literally the same thing. So if you already have this, you are golden. However, I will still go over it in case you do not. So, really what we need to do here, ignoring all the extra stuff. This is stuff we've done from a very, very long time ago. We determined what player was being hit by this hitbox. We determined if there was actually a collision. And what we were doing is we were grabbing our hurtbox and seeing if there was a collision between the two. We're really going to be doing the same thing. However, we have to think about it slightly differently now. We could have a collision that occurs on any of the hurtboxes in our simple hurtbox array. I mean, think about it. If we have 5 hurtboxes, we have one for our legs, our chest, our head, and say we're doing an attack and the mutant has 2 for his arm that is extending, because characters can punish other characters while they're doing an attack. They have different parts of their body that can be hit. So say we have 5 hurtboxes currently. If any of those hurtboxes are collided with or overlapped with by a hitbox, we need to deal damage to the character. So I've made a function called check simple collision. You can do this by copying check complex collision if you have it, or just make a new function right here. Then I have a player reference that I pass in, and I just made this a type of my base character. So I made it the code class fighter template character object reference. And I also have an output parameter. You can add these parameters by pressing this little plus of has collision occurred, and I've made it a Boolean. We're going to determine if any of the hurtboxes in here have been collided with, and then deal damage if they have. So first of all, I've made sure that the player reference we're passing in is valid. You could do this prior to the function as well. Doesn't really matter. Either way, player reference, if it's valid. If it is, we want to drag off of it and grab the simple hurtbox array. So we want to grab all the hurtboxes that this character has. We then want to drag off of the array and loop through each of them. I loop through with a break because if a collision with any of the hurtboxes occurs, we know the character wants to take damage. We don't really care which one gets hit, just the fact that one gets hit is enough. Then drag off of this and check is overlapping component. All right, and we want to check if it's overlapping the hitbox display. Remember, this is the hitbox actor BP. So not the hurtbox, this is the hitbox. This is the attack that is here. It could be a projectile, could be a melee attack. So we want to see if we're overlapping the hitbox display. All right, so that's what we're doing. I'll get rid of that. That's what we're doing here. We bring this into a branch. And if this is true, it is overlapping, then we set collision occurred to be true. Collision occurred is a local variable that I've made. You see the local variable section here? You can press plus to add one. This means that it is only a variable within this function. Once this function leaves, we no longer need this variable. So it saves us space, and we also know exactly where this is being set. So it's false by default. Make sure you have that. And set it to be true upon collision. With this, you can see the white line comes all the way back and goes into the break, which will automatically set it into the completed node. However, if it's false, nothing happens. This is good because it will then go the next loop. It'll check the next hitbox in this array and see if a collision occurred, and if it did, it will end the loop. The loop will either complete when all the hurtboxes have been checked or a collision has occurred, and once it completes, we want to use our collision occurred local variable, and we want to drag this into the return node. If you delete this return node for any reason, you can add it back by typing in return node, add return node, and we'll come up. Okay? Then if a collision does occur, we just want to pull this out to a branch, and we already had this in the past, just not from this function. And if it's true that a collision occurred, we want to go back and do all this logic. This is all stuff we had in the past. It deals with how much damage and frames that we should include. So not a big deal here. Make sure you do this for this section and for this section. Basically player 1 and player 2. Okay. Wonderful. So now that you've changed all those things, your game should build again. And what this means is your capsule collider should no longer be the thing that determines if you're colliding with a character. So because of this, if we load the game, you can see our hurtboxes. It does take a little bit of a second for them to block because it kind of depends on quite a few things. But you can see that there is a collision that occurs between the hurtboxes and it stops the characters. Now, because we've chosen to ignore collision, when we're jumping, we can jump through each other. And this is what I was talking about. We shouldn't really be able to do this. You could leave it if you like it. But this is because we were opting to ignore collisions. Now, what this really accomplishes is it will allow us to jump through our opponent in times like this. It's not something we really need right now. It's just something I want to show you for what's to come. So with that taken care of, what we need to do if you want to set up this event is to event ignore player to player collision. Remember this blueprint implementable event, if I could speak, that we have? You can just search for the name. So ignore player to player collision. When you type it in, it'll come up with this. It'll already have the boolean attached. You can drag this off into a branch. And then you can just take the main hurtbox component and set the collision response to channel. When this is the case, we'll actually really need to do this for both players if we want one player to be able to pass through the other. And in this case, we don't really need it for the jumping. The jumping was just an example because we don't actually shrink the hurtboxes yet. But one thing we do need to do is fix up our throw logic now, because now that we're not using the capsule collider anymore for the collision, it doesn't really matter if we're ignoring collision on it when we throw the opponent through the other. We need to make sure that the hurtboxes are being ignored. So if you go to where your throws are in your animation blueprint, and this only applies if you've A, already done throws, and B, if you have actually have this set up to work this way, where we ignore collision. So in our apply throw force event, we were previously using the capsule component, and we were using the channel of pawn and setting the response to be overlap. So the capsule component was was overlapping with pawns, which would make the capsule components overlap with each other, which would allow your players to go through each other. Now it's a little bit different because our hurtbox needs to be able to overlap pawn as well. And because of this, we need to make sure that both players are overlapping with each other. And this is fine because we're throwing anyway. So, if we go from a throw into a hit, or, when we do tag teams, if we have another player come in, there will still be collision with hitboxes and thrown opponents and things like that. But we do want the player to be able to be thrown through the other player. So ignoring both of them is okay here. It is acceptable here. So you can see where I had capsule component before. I'm going to take that out now. Now we're going to drag off our character reference and use main hurtbox instead. Get main hurtbox. This can stay exactly the same. Just make sure you're setting pawn to be overlap. You could technically do ignore as well, but again, what I said earlier, in this case, now we're going to want to know some things when overlap occurs, whether we're blocking or not. So I do prefer the overlap response here. And then what I've done is added an additional statement here. So we already had this launching occurring when they were facing right and things like that. But something else we could do that's additional here is we can grab the other player. So this is the player that's applying the throw force, or basically the player that is throwing, or the player that is being thrown. However, in this case, we do want to also have the thrower have their hurtbox set to the same response. That way they can both be overlap and they can both go through each other as opposed to trying to block. So to do that, I just grab other player. This is the character reference that is being thrown. I grab the other player, get other player. I drag off of this and cast it to the base character BP, since the base character BP is the one that has the main hurtbox component on it. However, you could also use the simple hurtbox array. And then set collision response to channel overlap. All right. The reason I'm using main hurtbox here as opposed to the overlap array, there's not really a great reason. It's more so because I think the main hurtbox is going to be the one that is meant to block, and the other hurtboxes are kind of there just to be able to take damage. I haven't quite worked that out yet, so it's subject to change. I'm testing around with a lot of fighting games. I'm trying Mortal Kombat, Killer Instinct, Street Fighter, and a little bit of BlazBlue as well. I'm trying to figure out the best way to handle this and how most fighting games do it. So for next episode, this will definitely be smoothed out. But right now, I'm still figuring it out. So we might do it for the array of hurtboxes, or we might just do it for the main hurtbox. I'll have more on that next episode. But for now, this works, especially since we only have one hurtbox. Since we did change both of them, we also have to update the move collider to mesh when we are deciding to block again. So again, instead of using capsule component here to block the pawn channel, we're going to use our main hurtbox. You can get rid of the capsule component. And I also am grabbing the other player off this character reference, casting it to the base character blueprint, grabbing the main hurtbox from that, and setting that back to be, this is actually supposed to be block. I did not do that. So there we go. After a throw, make sure you set them both back to block. Now, that's collision with hurtboxes fixed up. The last thing I want to fix up is in our character BP, I want to fix up some settings that allow us to push properly. So we're not pushing inconsistently based on momentum and things like that. Remember, we're trying to get rid of any of that. We want everything to be as intended as possible, right? There's things that work, but they could be different based on certain circumstances, like our character's speed, and we don't really want that. So if we go into our base character BP and go to our character movement, we can scroll down to, there's a few different boxes here. I'll show you exactly how I have it set up. So I have maintain horizontal ground velocity, and I set this to be false. This was something that I did while I was pushing prior, and it did help a bit because it tries to keep your velocity regardless of if you're colliding and trying to walk up something. So I'm going to leave that unchecked. However, the big thing we want to change is if we scroll down, the big thing we want to change is in character movement physics interaction. I've actually turned it off entirely because this has to deal with pushing logic, and we can use that. I mean, if we want to push based off different mass values and things like that of characters. If we want to get that into it, we could use it, but we don't need it. So we should really get rid of the calculation in general, and we should also just disable it to make our lives easier. We already have our pushing logic done. If you disable this in your base character BP, it will automatically be disabled for your other characters as well. You can see it is here. And so it's up to you if you want to do that. You don't necessarily need it. Now that we are using the boxes collision as opposed to a capsule component, it will probably work off the bat anyway, because the way that collision works with objects like shapes, or standard shapes, as opposed to things like capsule colliders that have additional logic tied to them, is that it will just do a regular push when we're adding an actor offset. There's no real like jaggedness or anything that can get in the way. So you can see if we're both walking into each other, before that would kind of cause issues because you would walk into each other for a bit. A little bit of momentum would actually be built up here, and then you would push very slowly against the other player. In this case, if both players are walking into each other, we do not allow any sort of pushing. Otherwise, the character that is walking does apply proper pushing. It's not different or varying speeds. It's always the same speed. And that's exactly what we want. So all this logic is working as intended now. We have static jumps. We have being able to jump through each other or change our collision channels when we want. So if we want collision to be completely ignored at certain points by just the characters alone and their hurt boxes and not specifically their attacks, we can also do that. You can see the hurt boxes are a little bit off because I was using the standard modify hurt box function that we made as opposed to using the new hurt box. The correct values for the new hurt box, so the hurt box doesn't reset properly. But we'll cover all this in the next episode because we're going to overhaul the changing hurt box system, which is going to basically make this exactly how it's done in the quote-unquote real fighting games when hurt boxes are made and, you know, resized on certain attacks, certain movements, and all of that good stuff. So this video was a general enhancements video again, but this is really, really good because we're going to be able to modify our hurt boxes when we want them. So on command, we're going to be able to modify them. And also our collision goes off of this now, so we have full control to add things like throw boxes and all these other things that could be useful. So there we go, guys. That's all I got for you today. If you enjoyed, please subscribe. Can't wait to show you what's in the next episode where we go over all that hurt box stuff. It'll also fix up all the jankiness with the actual capsule collider collision because it could be weird and it can sometimes throw you off or actually do some things like bounce you back when you attack and different things like that that are just caused by these collision issues. Yeah, that's all I got for you. So if you enjoyed, please subscribe. It does more for me and the channel than anything else you can do. I just really appreciate it. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. I will be happy to help you out. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership and Patreon subscribers and supporters. Thank you guys so much for all the love and support you've given. Every time this game gets, you know, an upgrade, I get so excited because I'm glad to show it. I'm glad to show the progress. Thank you guys so much for everything. I really, really appreciate it. Anyway, guys, like I said, that's all I got for you, so I'll let you go. But thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.